Welcome back, everybody. This is Parker Hurley. We are on to team number 28 on my team-by-team previews. We are under the Houston Texans here. So what we do with these previews is I look at every team's I wrote articles back in May. I wrote 5 questions that I wanted answered throughout the regular season. We're going to answer those questions now, and then we're going to go through the roster, come up with 5 more questions that we'll need answered at the draft. And then at the draft, we'll bring up 5 more questions for the regular season and continue to go through. So 28 overall, Houston Texans, disappointing end, but a really, started off 0-3, end up making a serious playoff run, winning a playoff game, but then a huge, honestly, it could feel like, they're one of the hottest defenses in the NFL and maybe the only team that could have competed with Seattle on the AFC side because they at least had the defense that could go toe for toe with them. And maybe they could have turned Seattle's offense over in the same way. And it's funny because one of the first videos I did on my YouTube channel here, and check out the first 27 teams I did, but also Texans fans, I talked about how I thought this team was so similar to Seattle that their defense could just run through the AFC and all they needed was a quarterback who didn't turn the football over. And while I thought that could be Stroud and the Texans, it ended up being Sam Darnold in the Seahawks, and they just needed a quarterback who wasn't going to turn the football over, and maybe they could have made that run. So here are my 5 questions back in May. First one was, how are the receivers going to shake out? Talked about how they added Christian Kirk, but he's coming back from an injury. They have Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel on the out as new additions through the draft. And it's funny because you would have expected Higgins and Noel to be the starters here. And by the end of the season, they seem to, start to get a bigger role, especially Higgins. Higgins really had a pretty good rookie season and really stepped up as that outside threat by the end of the season. Noel was struggling to beat out Christian Kirk, but it's interesting because you look in their yards per route run, Jaden Higgins has 1.46. And for the majority of the season, he was behind Xavier Hutchinson, who had 1.05 yards per route run. And then Jalen Noel has 1.4 yards per route run, and Christian Kirk had 1.16. So through the majority of the season, these two rookies were on the sideline and being backups to Xavier Hutchinson and Christian Kirk, but consistently were outperforming them. So it's going to be really interesting because Higgins has solidified himself, and he's going to head into the offseason as that outside threat across from Nico Collins. You would assume that Noel has shown enough, and I mean, he was dynamic as a return option as well. You think with an offseason, as long as the offensive coordinator doesn't have some vendetta against him, which seems to be the only reason he's not playing more in the first place, you would think that Noel would probably step into that slot role next year. So for this Texans offense and why they seem to hit that floor or that issue in New England is that they just didn't have that consistency from these young receivers throughout the season. And then when Nico Collins goes down, they couldn't really find anyone to, separate in those moments. And it got CJ Stroud, panicking and making awful decisions and throws. It wasn't necessarily on the receivers, but the receivers did not progress enough, despite the fact that when they were on the field, they were performing pretty well. And like I said, by the end of the season, Higgins was fine. He just wasn't ready to overcome a Nico Collins injury. But Noel was not nearly as impactful or really on the field as much, because when he was on the field, he was creating impact. He just wasn't on the field as much. So my second question, does Woody Marks have a role this year? I talked about how he's not a day 2 pick, but he slid into a situation where he should have found a significant role right away. Turned out to be a pretty good call for me. Ended up being a pretty good hit in fantasy, like best ball drafts, where you can set it and forget it and just get the best of what Woody Marks gives you. So I talked about how Joe Mixon was aging and isn't much of a pass catcher anyways. And it turned out that Joe Mixon missed the entire season with some sort of questionable injury. And so they bring in Nick Chubb. Chubb is the exact same role as Joe Mixon. And not only that, he's older and a little more banged up. And so Woody Marks ended up leading the team in carries. I knew he would lead the team amongst running backs in targets and yards and all of that, but ended up leading them in carries as well. So he ended up having a much bigger role than even I expected, although I expected him as a rookie to step up immediately. Another rookie I expected to step up immediately. I said, when does Ariante Ursary get to start? I said, there's some competition for the Texans at tackle, and he's not a first-round tackle, so you never know if those guys can start right away. But this is a guy that the competition wasn't good enough, and he slid in at left tackle. Was up and down, which you would expect from a second-round player moving to left tackle for his first season. But by the end of the season, I think you show enough flashes that you could trust what he can bring moving forward. And it's just more about, can they put enough pieces around him that they can be successful on the offensive line? Because the offensive line, arguably more than Stroud, or as much as Stroud in that final game, but the offensive line throughout the season was the biggest issue. And that's why my fourth question was, continuing on the offensive line, how will the interior offensive line shake out? Talked about how they moved on from Kenyon Green and Shaq Mason, but they didn't like bring in big names to replace them. Guys like Laken Tomlinson and Ed Ingram, it's kind of just like shuffling the chairs a little bit on the interior. Jake Andrews ended up being a pretty big, I think he was injured in 2024, stepped up big in 2025, ended up being a starter at center. He'll be back next season. He was like slightly below average to average as a center. So with him having 1 year left on his deal, you wonder what they're going to do with him. But at the very least, he should slide into center or a competition for center next year. The biggest issue was that I think they liked Titus Howard at left tackle. They just didn't have the right tackle. They wanted Blake Fisher to start at right tackle. Wasn't going to happen. So Titus Howard has to start, some games at right tackle. Then they bring in Trent Brown. They can push Titus Howard back to left guard. Trent Brown gets banged up. Titus Howard has to go back to right tackle. So in a perfect world, Titus Howard could be at left guard, but he wasn't there consistently this past season. And then Ed Ingram is a free agent and was okay. So they had, an okay center, an okay right guard. Those two were, first year starting in those positions. Titus Howard is fluctuating between left guard and right tackle. The right tackle is fluctuating consistently between three different guys, and their left tackle is a rookie. That's where a lot of these issues came into place. So we'll talk about like where they can go with the offensive line as we get into the roster. My fifth question, how does Jalen Smith fit into the secondary? Which this is a really great point for me. I talk about how my first four questions were about the offense and how did they do enough on offense? Do they have enough on offense? Is the offense good enough? Because I was never concerned about the defense, and yet they invest a third-round pick on a cornerback. They have Kamari Lassiter, who I talked about. I really liked him as a rookie, and I really like Jalen Petrie as well. Now Petrie's a potential All-Pro. Lassiter's making Pro Bowls. Derek Stingley's one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. I thought, why do they need this third-round rookie at cornerback? And I understand that he got injured, but even if he doesn't get injured, I don't see how he would have fit into any role this offseason. And then you look into it, and 4 of the 5 offensive linemen who were drafted after Jalen Smith made starts this season. So they could have had a Caleb Rogers who went the pick after him. And while he was up and down for the Raiders, just it's another body that could slot in there on the offensive line. And they really needed somebody like him. And he could have been that left guard in some of those moments where they were shuffling at that position. So I just didn't think that was such a great fit, or I questioned why they went so high for someone like Jalen Smith. And like I said, it's hard to victory lap it because he got injured. But it's also fair in my thought that they simply don't need a cornerback, or did not need a cornerback in that spot, and they needed more roles on offense, and they didn't address it well enough, and that was one of their biggest issues. So moving on to their roster, C.J. Stroud is due for a contract this offseason. They could play out his 5th-year deal, but that's a very risky game for a quarterback. Todd McShay has mentioned trading him. I think that would be a very risky decision for the Houston Texans, who just saw what it was like when you lose, Deshaun Watson can't get you over the hump. He obviously had this personal, not a good person. So I understand why they traded him, but you saw that the Texans, when they lost him, went into the gutter for a few years because it's hard to find that quarterback who can keep you in these games. And I understand that C.J. Stroud was awful in both of his playoff games this year, but this is a guy who's in his 3rd NFL season, and he's 3-3 in the playoffs. Like, he's won 3 playoff games, whether his defense helped him or not. He's been in that mix. And in the first 2 seasons as a quarterback, he had 4 touchdowns and 1 interception in the playoffs. So it's not like he was necessarily bad in those games. He just had a bad couple weeks due to, like I said, he's in his 3rd season, 2nd offensive coordinator, multiple young receivers who didn't get to play during the season, shuffling at multiple positions on the offensive line, a rookie left tackle, now on the road against Pittsburgh, and now Nico Collins is injured against New England. And we're going to judge him based off of that, and we're not going to judge him based off the fact that, 62 touchdowns and 25 interceptions throughout the course of his career, 19 touchdowns, 8 interceptions last season, not a high touchdown number, but still good enough, especially with the low 8 interceptions in the entire regular season, 5 interceptions in the playoffs. Are you really going to say that, this is who he is? Or are you going to say, like I said, 2 years prior, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception in the playoffs? So CJ Stroud is 24 years old. He's had a lot of questions in his offensive environment, and he still continually wins 1 playoff game every single season. So, imagine if CJ Stroud, 1, has a good environment around him, and then 2, starts to feel comfortable with all the pieces within himself and starts to play better within himself like he did during that rookie season. I don't think at age 24, when like I said, he wasn't bad in the loss to the Chiefs in his second season, and he had a great playoff run and lost to a Mike McDonald defense, the Baltimore Ravens, one of the best defenses, was how the Texans lost in his rookie season. And then he loses to the Kansas City Chiefs, who go on to the Super Bowl in his second season. And then, this year he loses to Drake May, who ends up making the Super Bowl as well. And I understand this performance was awful, but to think about trading him after this performance would be stunning, in my opinion. I think the thought is that you need to build around him. And if he gets a stable environment and a stable play caller, maybe things won't be as chaotic in the biggest moments, and maybe he'll feel a little more comfortable and confident. So at running back, they're probably going to cut Joe Mixon, save $8 million. Woody Marks is there, but like I said, I thought he was more of a pass catching back anyways. So they should probably look for a downhill runner to complement him. Nico Collins, Jaden Higgins, and Jalen Noel, I think they should trust Noel in the slot and bring all of them back and let Christian Kirk walk. Xavier Hutchinson is still around. Tank Dell may be back from his serious injury. That would be significant. I mean, let's judge him after a season with, what if he had Nico, Jaden takes a step forward, and he has Tank Dell now in the slot? Let's judge CJ Stroud after that, maybe, and maybe let's not trade him away and put, who are they going to start at quarterback with? If all this starts to come together, Dalton Schultz, they could save $6 million, I believe. And I just think he brings so little to the table, and he's such an invaluable player. And Cade Stover could do a lot of what he does, and they could just invest more of those resources even in a cheaper tight end who could bring similar production to Dalton Schultz. They seem to like Dalton Schultz. They're paying him $15 million. I would probably look to move him, and potentially even they could trade him, which would be very valuable if I were them, especially in this tight end class. So that's something that I would look to do if I was the Texans. It'll be interesting to see if they do that. Like I said, Ursary, you probably trust him enough to start at left tackle. You would like, in a perfect world, for Titus Howard to be your left guard. And then you have, Jake Andrews and Jaret Patterson, who started at left guard a little bit too much, but Patterson could compete and be a backup to Jake Andrews at center. So the real thing you need here is right guard and right tackle. Blake Fisher hasn't shown enough. I think you invest a serious resource in the right tackle position, and then, bring in some sort of veteran right guard, and then maybe even draft a guy. All their resources should go into improving the right side of their offensive line, and then potentially finding a center of the future, because Jake Andrews is due a contract. But I don't mind that there's stability there, because even CJ Stroud hasn't had the same starting center for, a good period of time, with Patterson and Juice Scruggs at times, and now it is Jake Andrews. So that would be nice. Daniil Hunter and Will Anderson will be back. They'll need to replace their third rusher there. I forget his name right now. But either way, they'll need to replace him. So they'll just look for that. But it's a very insignificant role for them. Derek Barnett. So that was an insignificant role anyways. And then Tommy Togiai had a really good season. And then Sheldon Rankins is a free agent, and as is Tim Settle. So they feel good about one of those spots, but they're going to need to put some investments into the interior defensive line this offseason. But that's the only spot on the defense they're going to need. Al-Shaair is great. T.O. started for the most of last year. He's going to be due a contract. So the question is, do they bring him back with some of his questions in coverage? But it's still, if he's the biggest weakness on this defense and he's coming back for, multiple year starter, knows his role, knows his fit and everything, it's not a bad spot to be in. Like I said, Jalen Smith will be back. So between Lassiter, Petrie, and Stingley, and then they have Jalen Smith as their fourth cornerback, they're going to feel really good there. And then Caitlin Bullock was close to an All-Pro as a free safety last year, was a ball hawk. Jalen Reed started to come around towards the end of the season. He was a rookie from Penn State, started to become their box safety, but he was a rookie. He was up and down. He got injured to end the season. They were shuffling bad players in at times. MJ Stewart, guys like that, depth special teams types players, were getting too many snaps for them in the box there. Miles Bryant, another guy. So they're going to need to find some sort of safety, or do they trust Reed in his second season? That'll be shown by how much they invest in the safety position this offseason. Moving to my questions and my needs, running back, interior offensive line, right tackle, and safety. And then interior defensive line is another one I think they'll need to address unless they bring back those guys like Sheldon Rankins and Tim Settle. So my 5 questions are, will they extend CJ Stroud? Like I said, there's the trade talk, but I don't think that's going to happen. Will they cut Joe Mixon, and how do they add a downhill runner? Is it through the draft? Do they just bring in another veteran like Mixon and Chubb were? And then how do they improve the offensive line? I think mostly through the right side. I think they should invest resources both in the draft and free agency. Do they extend guys like Tommy Togiai and Teoto, or do they look to the draft to replace some of those guys? Do they look to interior defensive line and linebacker more than maybe I'm suggesting right now? And then do they trust Jalen Reed at safety? Because if not, they really don't have many needs other than the interior defensive line. On that defense, so that is the Texans. Really going to be interested to see what they can do on the offensive line. I doubt they trade CJ Stroud, so we're going to see if I'm wrong about that. But I am Parker Hurley. That was the 28th team. We're going to be on the 29th team here tomorrow. So tune in tomorrow to check that out, or check everything else I do out on my YouTube channels.